The blood-curdling scream pierced the tranquil dawn air of Promise Creek, jolting Zachariah Wilkes from his fitful slumber. He grabbed his Colt revolver from beneath his pillow and burst from his small cabin, barefoot and shirtless, his eyes scanning the horizon for danger as the Montana Territory's spring sun began to crest the distant mountains. The year was 1879, and Promise Creek had grown from a dusty outpost to a modest settlement over the past decade. Zachariah Zach Tomost had been there nearly from the beginning, arriving as a young man of 20 after the Civil War left him with little but nightmares and a talent for survival. The scream came again, and this time Zach recognized its source, the Miller wagon, which had arrived just yesterday with a group of settlers heading west. Without hesitation, he sprinted across the dewy grass, his muscled frame moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to responding to danger. "Raiders!" someone shouted from the direction of the general store. Zach's jaw clenched as he ran faster. He'd seen what bandits could do to innocent travelers. As he approached the small circle of wagons at the edge of town, he saw 3 men on horseback. They were rough-looking characters with bandanas covering the lower half of their faces, waving pistols at the terrified settlers who had been roused from their sleep. "Please," a woman's voice cut through the chaos. "Take what you want, but leave us be." Zach slowed his approach, keeping to the shadows of a nearby oak. The woman who had spoken stood protectively in front of 3 young children and an elderly couple. Her auburn hair caught the early morning light, and even in the midst of danger, Zach couldn't help but notice her fierce determination. "Shut your mouth, lady," one of the bandits snarled, dismounting his horse. "We'll take what we want when we want it." That was all Zach needed to hear. He stepped from the shadows, his revolver raised. "I suggest you gentlemen reconsider." The bandits whirled around, startled by his sudden appearance. The one who had dismounted reached for his gun, but Zach was faster. A warning shot cracked through the air, kicking up dirt inches from the man's boot. "Next one won't miss," Zach said, his voice calm but carrying a deadly promise. "Now, you boys have 2 choices. Ride away and live to see another sunrise, or stay and meet your maker. It's all the same to me." There was a tense moment as the bandits seemed to weigh their options. Then, with a string of curses, they mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Zach kept his gun trained on them until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he turn to the settlers, who were watching him with a mixture of relief and awe. "Thank you," the auburn-haired woman said, stepping forward. "I'm Fiona Blackwood. These are my brother's children." She gestured to the 3 youngsters clinging to her skirts, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10. "Their parents," her voice broke. "Yellow fever took them in Kansas City. I'm taking them to my aunt in Oregon." Zach holstered his gun. "Zachariah Wilkes. Most folks call me Zach." He looked around at the frightened faces of the settlers. "Those men might come back with friends. Promise Creek isn't much, but we look after our own. You'd all best move your wagons closer to town until you're ready to move on." An elderly man stepped forward, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "We're obliged to you, Mr. Wilkes. I'm Elijah Thompson. My wife Martha and I are heading to California. Our son has a ranch there." One by one, the settlers introduced themselves, 5 families in all, plus Fiona and her niece and nephews. As they spoke, Zach noticed other townspeople approaching, drawn by the commotion. "Is everyone all right?" asked Henry Mason, the town's mayor and owner of the general store. "We heard shots." "Raiders," Zach explained briefly. "They've gone for now, but they might be back." Mayor Mason frowned. "The marshal's not due back for another week. Then we'll have to look after our visitors ourselves," Zach said firmly. "These folks need protection until they can continue their journey." "And who's going to provide that protection?" one of the settlers asked nervously. Before Zach could respond, Mayor Mason clapped him on the shoulder. "Zach here is the best shot in 3 counties and knows this territory better than most. If anyone can keep you safe, it's him." Zach shot the mayor an irritated glance. He hadn't volunteered for the job, but as he looked at the hopeful faces around him, especially the 3 orphaned children clinging to Fiona Blackwood's skirts, he knew he couldn't refuse. "I'll do what I can," he said gruffly. but everyone needs to follow my instructions to the letter. First things first, let's move these wagons. Under Zach's direction, the settlers repositioned their wagons in a defensive circle near the town's modest church. Throughout the day, the people of Promise Creek brought food, blankets, and offers of assistance. Zach organized the men into watch shifts and taught the women how to handle firearms just in case. Fiona Blackwood proved to be a quick study with a rifle. "I've never fired a gun before," she admitted as she took aim at a makeshift target Zach had set up. "You're a natural," Zach said, surprised by her steady hand and sharp eye. "Just remember to breathe out as you squeeze the trigger." She followed his advice and the shot hit just outside the bullseye. A satisfied smile spread across her face, and for a moment, Zach found himself staring. In the afternoon sunlight, her green eyes sparkled with determination, and a few strands of auburn hair had escaped her practical bun to frame her face. "Mr. Wilkes?" she asked, noticing his stare. Zach cleared his throat. "Good shot, Miss Blackwood. Try again." Over the next few days, Zach found himself spending more and more time with Fiona and her niece and nephews. 8-year-old Thomas, 6-year-old William, and 4-year-old Emma were still grieving the loss of their parents, but they were resilient children. Zach taught Thomas how to whittle, showed William how to identify animal tracks, and found himself carrying little Emma on his shoulders as they walked around town. "You're good with them," Fiona observed one evening as they sat by the campfire after the children had gone to sleep. "Do you have children of your own?" Zach shook his head. "Never married. A handsome man like you, I find that hard to believe." Zach poked at the fire with a stick, uncomfortable with the compliment. "War changes a man. Some things are hard to leave behind." Fiona was quiet for a moment. "My brother fought too. He came back different, jumpy, haunted, but he found peace eventually with his wife and children." She looked at Zach with understanding in her eyes. "The past doesn't have to define your future, Mr. Wilkes." "Zach," he corrected her softly. "Just Zach," she smiled. "Zach, then?" Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Zach was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver. "Stay here," he instructed, but Fiona was already reaching for the rifle he'd taught her to use. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "These children are my responsibility." Zach wanted to argue, but there was no time. Together, they moved to the edge of the camp where they could see a group of riders approaching slowly. To Zach's relief, it was Marshal Tucker returning earlier than expected, accompanied by 3 deputies. "Heard there was trouble," the marshal said, dismounting. "Ran into some unsavory characters on the trail who mentioned a settlement ripe for picking." "They won't find us so ripe anymore," Zach replied. "The settlers are armed and ready." Marshal Tucker nodded approvingly. "Good man, Wilkes. We'll stick around for a few days, make sure those raiders don't come back." With the marshal's arrival, the immediate danger seemed to pass. The settlers began preparing to continue their journey westward. Wagon wheels were checked, supplies replenished, and goodbyes exchanged with the townspeople who had welcomed them. Zach found himself dreading Fiona's departure. In just a week, she had become a fixture in his life. Her strength, her kindness, her way with the children, all of it had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. The night before the wagon train was set to leave, Zach found Fiona sitting alone by the dying campfire, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She looked up, her face softening at the sight of him. "Please do." Zach sat beside her, closer than was strictly proper, but Fiona didn't move away. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the embers glow. "The children will miss you," Fiona said finally. "Especially Emma. She asks for Mr. Zach constantly." "I'll miss them too," Zach admitted. Then, gathering his courage, he added, "and their aunt." Fiona turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Will you, Zach?" "More than I thought possible." The words came out rough, almost against his will. "I know you have plans, a life waiting in Oregon, but," she prompted when he fell silent. Zach ran a hand through his dark hair. "But I find myself wishing you'd stay here in Promise Creek." Fiona's breath caught. "Are you asking me to abandon my plans? My aunt is expecting us." "I'm asking you to consider other possibilities," Zach said carefully. Promise Creek is growing. The children could have a good life here. You could have a good life here." He paused, then added softly, "With me." Fiona stared at him, clearly taken aback by his declaration. "Zach, we've known each other a week." "Sometimes a week is all it takes to know what's right," he countered. "I've spent years keeping to myself, not letting anyone close. Then you and those children came along, and suddenly, I'm remembering what it's like to care about someone more than my own safety." Fiona reached out and took his hand, her touch sent warmth spreading through him. "I care for you too, Zach, more than I should, perhaps." "But the children need stability, a home." "I have a home," Zach interrupted. "It's not much, but I built it with my own hands. There's room for additions, room for a family." Fiona's eyes widened at the implication. "Are you proposing to me, Zachariah Wilkes?" Zach swallowed hard. "I suppose I am, though I plan to be more eloquent about it." A smile tugged at the corners of Fiona's mouth. "It's rather sudden." "Life out here is sudden," Zach replied. "Beautiful and harsh and unpredictable, like you." He squeezed her hand. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Just asking you to consider it before you leave tomorrow." Fiona nodded slowly. "I will consider it, Zach, I promise." The next morning dawned bright and clear. The wagons were loaded and ready to depart. Zach stood with Marshal Tucker and Mayor Mason, watching as the settlers made their final preparations. His eyes sought out Fiona, who was helping Emma into their wagon. She looked up and met his gaze across the distance. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Zach felt his heart sink. She had made her decision, and it wasn't him. Then, to his surprise, Fiona said something to Elijah Thompson, who nodded and took Emma from her. Fiona walked purposefully towards Zach, her green eyes never leaving his face. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said when she reached him, ignoring the curious looks from the marshal and the mayor. "And," Zach managed, his mouth suddenly dry, "and I have 3 children who need a father," Fiona said. "A strong, kind man who will protect them and teach them and love them." She took a deep breath. "If your offer still stands, I believe we could build a good life here in Promise Creek." Joy surged through Zach, so intense it almost hurt. "The offer stands, Miss Blackwood, now and always." Fiona's smile was like the sunrise, brilliant and full of promise. "Then yes, Zachariah Wilkes, yes to Promise Creek, yes to building a home together, and yes to being your wife." Zach wanted nothing more than to take her in his arms, but he was acutely aware of their audience. Instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing it gently. "You've made me the happiest man in the territory." Mayor Mason cleared his throat. "Well, seems we'll be having a wedding in Promise Creek." Marshal Tucker grinned and clapped Zach on the back. "About time, Wilkes. You've been alone too long." The news spread quickly among the settlers and townspeople. There were congratulations, good-natured teasing, and not a few tears from the women. The Thompson family offered to deliver a letter to Fiona's aunt in Oregon, explaining her change of plans. The children's reactions were mixed. Emma was delighted at the prospect of staying with Mr. Zach. William was cautiously optimistic about the fishing creek Zach had promised to show him. Thomas, the oldest, was more reserved. "You're not trying to replace our pa, are you?" He asked Zach bluntly that evening as they sat on the porch of what would soon be their shared home. "No, son, I'm not," Zach answered honestly. "No one could replace your pa, but I promise to care for you and your brother and sister as if you were my own. And to honor the memory of the man who brought you into this world." Thomas considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Aunt Fiona smiles more when you're around. Pa would have liked that." Zach placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you, Thomas. That means a great deal to me." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small white church of Promise Creek. Fiona wore a simple blue dress with white lace that the women of the town had helped her alter. Zach, unaccustomed to formal attire, endured a stiff collar and new boots for the occasion. As Fiona walked down the aisle toward him, Thomas and William escorting her while Emma scattered wildflower petals, Zach felt a peace he hadn't known since before the war. This woman, with her courage, her compassion, and her 3 orphan charges, had given him a second chance at life. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Zach finally allowed himself to embrace Fiona, kissing her with all the love that had grown in his heart over the past weeks. The townsfolk celebrated with a feast and dancing that lasted well into the night. When it was finally time for the newlyweds to retire, Zach carried Emma, who had fallen asleep amid the festivities, while Fiona guided the sleepy boys to their new home. Once the children were settled in the small room Zach had hastily prepared for them, he and Fiona stood alone in the main room of the cabin, suddenly shy with each other. "It's not much," Zach said apologetically, looking around at the simple furnishings, "but I'll build on as we need it." Fiona stepped closer to him, reaching up to touch his face. "It's perfect, Zach, it's a home," he covered her hand with his own. "You're my home now, Fiona Wilkes, you and those children." Their kiss was tentative at first, then deepened with growing passion. When they finally parted, breathless, Fiona's green eyes were dark with desire. Zach lifted her into his arms and carried her to their bedroom, where they discovered each other fully for the first time as husband and wife. Life in Promise Creek settled into a rhythm for the Wilkes family. Zach continued his work as a guide and occasional deputy to Marshal Tucker. Fiona took over teaching duties at the small schoolhouse when the previous teacher departed for Denver. The children thrived under their care, gradually healing from the loss of their parents as they embraced their new life. Their first challenge as a family came that winter, when a harsh blizzard struck the territory. For 3 days, they were snowbound in their cabin, rationing food and wood as the temperature dropped dangerously low. On the second night, little Emma developed a high fever. Zach watched helplessly as Fiona bathed the child's burning forehead with snow melted over their dwindling fire. "She needs a doctor," Fiona whispered, her face drawn with worry. Zach looked out the window at the howling blizzard. "Doc Jenkins is on the other side of town." "I don't know if I can make it through this storm." "You have to try," Fiona said, her eyes pleading. "She's getting worse, Zach." Without another word, Zach began bundling up in every layer he owned. As he prepared to venture into the storm, Thomas approached him with determined eyes. "I'm coming with you," the 8-year-old declared. "Emma's my sister." Zach knelt to the boy's level. "I need you here, son. You're the man of the house when I'm gone. Your aunt and siblings are counting on you to keep the fire going and help watch over Emma." Thomas straightened with pride at the responsibility. "Yes, sir, I won't let you down." Zach ruffled the boy's hair, then turned to Fiona. "I'll be back with Doc Jenkins, I promise." The journey through the blizzard was the most difficult Zach had ever undertaken. The wind cut like knives, and the snow was so thick he could barely see his hand in front of his face. Several times he lost his way, and once he fell into a snowdrift so deep he feared he wouldn't be able to climb out. But the thought of Emma's flushed face and Fiona's worried eyes drove him forward. After what seemed like hours, he reached Doc Jenkins's house on the other side of town. The return journey with the elderly doctor was even more treacherous, but they made it back to find Emma's condition worsening. The doctor worked through the night, with Fiona and Zach taking turns applying cold compresses and administering the medicine he had brought. By morning, Emma's fever had broken. Zach, who had been keeping vigil by her bedside, fell to his knees in relief. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether to Doc Jenkins, God, or some combination of the two, he wasn't sure. Fiona knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around him. "You saved her, Zach. You risked your life in that storm for a child not of your blood." Zach looked at her in surprise. "She's my daughter now, Fiona, just as the boys are my sons. Blood doesn't matter. Love does." The tears that filled Fiona's eyes matched his own. They held each other as the storm outside finally began to abate, their family intact. Spring brought new beginnings. The town of Promise Creek expanded with the arrival of more settlers. Zach added 2 rooms to their cabin with help from neighbors and the growing strength of Thomas and William, and Fiona shared news that filled Zach's heart with joy. She was expecting their child. "Are you happy?" she asked as they sat on their porch one evening, watching the children play in the yard. Zach placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "More than I ever thought possible. Did you ever imagine when those raiders attacked your wagon that this is where you'd end up?" Fiona leaned her head against his shoulder. "No, but I wouldn't change a thing." Their son, Daniel Zachariah Wilkes, was born on a warm September night in 1880. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's blue eyes. The children were fascinated by their new brother, especially Emma, who appointed herself his special protector. As Promise Creek grew, so did Zach's reputation. He became known not just as a skilled guide and marksman, but as a fair and honorable man. When Marshall Tucker retired 2 years later, the town council unanimously voted to offer Zach the position. "I don't know," he told Fiona as they discussed the offer. "Being marshal means more danger, more responsibility. It also means more stability for our family," Fiona pointed out. "And you've already proven you can protect those you love." Zach accepted the position, and with it came a new, larger house near the center of town. As marshal, he worked to ensure that Promise Creek remained a safe haven for all who settled there. Time passed, as it always does. Thomas, William, and Emma grew into fine young adults under Zach and Fiona's guidance. Daniel was joined by twin sisters, Sarah and Rebecca, completing their family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zach took Fiona back to the spot where they had first met, the clearing where her wagon had been when the raiders attacked. "It looks so different now," Fiona marveled, gazing at the thriving community that had sprung up around them. "Everything changes," Zach agreed, taking her hand. "Except how I feel about you." Fiona squeezed his hand. "Do you remember what you said to me that night by the campfire? That sometimes a week is all it takes to know what's right." Zach nodded, a smile playing at his lips. "Smartest thing I ever said." "You were right," Fiona said softly. "I knew in my heart you were the man I was meant to find, even if I was too practical to admit it at first." Zach drew her close. "I promised to protect them all, you and the children, but you saved me, Fiona. You brought me back to life when I thought that part of me was gone forever." As the sun set over Promise Creek, casting golden light across the land they had come to call home, Zach and Fiona Wilkes stood together, surrounded by the life they had built from a chance meeting and a promise kept. In the years that followed, their love story became something of a legend in those parts. How a lone cowboy had promised to protect a group of stranded settlers, only to find himself captivated by a courageous woman and her orphaned niece and nephews. How he had made her his bride and become a father to those children, and to the sons and daughters they created together. It was a story of the West, as it truly was not just a place of danger and hardship, but a place where love could flourish against all odds, where families could be forged by choice as well as blood, and where a promise made could lead to a lifetime of happiness.